is it?
Michael Jackson
Yes,
one?
we can get to that. Excuse me?
Michael Jackson one?
I'm a big fan of the Music Machine. Remember them? They'd always play with their... Actually, this is my dry erasing. I hate grabbing erasers. Do we have another chair over there? And there's plenty in front.
Am I in front of something?
You can't sit there.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out. I hadn't anticipated this many people. We would have put out more chairs. This is going to be, as you can tell, low tech. It's basically going to be me talking and writing on the board and drawing on the board. If anybody has any questions as we go through this, just please, interrupt. It's not a formal kind of presentation in that sense. I dislike PowerPoint, I dislike Prezi, I dislike computers, so I just wanted to use the whiteboard. There's not going to be anything projected up there, so as long as you can see this, we should be good. For anyone who's ever sat through a PowerPoint presentation, you know that it's kind of traditional for the last slide to be questions. And I'm going to start with that because this is such a big topic and there's so many people that ask me questions about it almost every week. So I'm going to open the floor to questions first. Does anybody want to ask anything about ebooks before we even start? And if not, I'll just go right into it. No? No takers? Okay. Well, we'll start with that. Can everybody tell me what that is? Cloud. Right. Now, why did I draw a cloud on the board? Okay, you're going to make me work for this. No. Exactly. Good. Okay. So this is the traditional model of libraries. You've got the library. It's a brick and mortar place, and I'm obviously oversimplifying. Petit Paterno is not quite this simple to get around. No. And obviously, we're talking about all the campuses and all the locations and all branch libraries. But for the purposes of the discussion, a library is a brick and mortar place where books and other stuff live. I'm also oversimplifying when I say books as opposed to ebooks. I don't want the AV people to think that I'm, not talking about other stuff as well, but we'll just simplify and say books. So the old model is you've got books in a library. This, as you pointed out, is a cloud, and this is where ebooks more or less live. Now, what are the implications of that? The first is that we really don't control our content anymore. In the old model, we had our books, they were in the building, we knew where they were, we did what we needed to do to manage them and to loan them out. But now the ebooks are up here in the cloud with very few exceptions. And by that I mean that the data, the ebooks themselves, are not on site, they're somewhere else. The implications of that include we have to get people to the cloud in order to get the ebooks, and we don't manage these pointers, or we manage them only partially. If you think about the old way to find a book in a library, you had a call number. There were basically two ways you could find a book. 3 if you wanted to ask a librarian, but 2 on your own. You could look in the catalog and find what you were looking for and then go retrieve it. Or you could do that antiquated thing called shelf browsing, where you'd actually go into the library and find a section that you were interested in and then kind of see what was available in the subject area that interested you. The problem with ebooks, in addition to them being not managed by us, is that they don't really exist in any meaningful sense, and that's why I chose the title of the talk that I did. This is actually a gross oversimplification because there are in fact, many clouds. There's an Elsevier cloud, there's a Wiley cloud, there's a Google Books cloud, there's as many clouds as you can imagine. And so that brings up all kinds of conundrums about how we manage these things as opposed to how we managed physical objects in an old library. And I know from seeing the audience of the people that are seated here, I know that you all get that. So that's what we're going to start from. Now, I want to give a couple examples of how this mediation between us and the ebook cloud is even more complicated than simply pointing with URLs. The traditional way of finding an ebook is to have a URL in the catalog record and people can simply click on the link and they'll, in theory, get there. we all know that that doesn't work a lot of the time, and that's one of our biggest challenges. Another part of the challenge is that we control what's in the catalog to an extent, but we don't control all this middle area, the DOIs, the servers, everything that exists between our catalog and the cloud that we're trying to get to. And not only do we not control it, but the number of people that do control it, all these vendors and other participants, is extraordinarily high, so it's a very chaotic, confusing landscape. In the old days, if something wasn't on the shelf, there was a finite number of people we could say, hey, why isn't this there? And we could go find out why it wasn't on the shelf and presumably get it back on the shelf as quickly as possible. With ebooks, there are a lot of other issues that we have to address before we can make sure that these things always get you where you want to be when you're looking for ebooks. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those down the road. Now, one of the questions that I get asked more than any other question is, how do the ebook records get in the CAT? There were 3 questions I put in the little email I sent out to interest people in this presentation. And one of the ones I hear most frequently is, there's an assumption that for every ebook we have access to, there's a record in the CAT. That is false for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is vendors don't always give us records for everything to which we have access. So we try to load comprehensive packages, but they simply goofed, and we don't have enough staff to know everything that we should have access to. So that's one problem. The second problem is that, or the second question rather, is if there's a link in the CAT, a record in the CAT or line search for a given item, does that necessarily mean we have access to it? I'd love to be able to say yes. I'd love to be able to say that anytime you find a record in the catalog, that means we have access to that Springer-Verlag book or the Wiley book or the Brill book. Unfortunately, that also is not the case. And again, it's very often the vendor that's goofed. We're buying ebooks now, not only individually title by title, but as all the selectors know, we're buying them in these aggregate compositions so that we don't really know comprehensively what we get and what we're supposed to get. We think we know, and they send us nice spreadsheets of saying, this is what you're paying $35,000 for. But very often, their mark record sets that they send to us to load into the CAT and line search don't match exactly. So Jamie and I and other people on the floor will frequently get emails that say, you know, this record is in the catalog, why am I not able to get to the resource? We have to go to the vendor, we have to say, should we be able to get to the resource or should we not be able to get to the resource? Sometimes they don't even know that. Then they have to go back to the licensing agreement and say, which did they buy, what imprint year was it? So it's a very convoluted process, and it's a lot less straightforward than the old model was. One of the other questions I get is about how records for ebooks get into the CAT and how they interreact. And does anybody know what that is?
Yeah.
So far? Any mathematicians? Venn diagram. So this is a very poorly drawn Venn diagram. And it's not totally appropriate to this situation, but it will kind of give you a sense for what I'm talking about. So the way that records get into the CAT, you have firm orders for ebooks. So just like regular books in the old days, a selector will identify a single title that we want to purchase, and the acquisitions folks will place a firm order, and part of that process will be to get a record into the catalog at that stage. So that's one way these records get in there.
Actually, Jeff.
Yes.
Quick. That's automatic. If I submit an order for an ebook, it's assumed that if there's an available record, it will be loaded.
My understanding, the acquisitions people can weigh in here, but I believe that as part of the process, when a selector contacts you to order something, you do put it in a record even if it's minimal level. Is that correct? As part of the ordering process. I'm getting nods, so yes.
And it's just like a book. It is part of the process that eventually it will get that one.
Correct. It's treated identically for all intents and purposes.
As you go along, can you give a sense of proportions here?
Yes.
This is, I would assume, not the largest source of ebooks.
No, this is I would describe as minimal. And we'll get to that in a second, literally a second. The second part is BibLoad. Now, This is a term that's become so horrifically familiar to me that I assume people know what it means, but the reason we refer to bibload is because the report that is used by Linux to load records into the catalog in a batch fashion is known as the bibload report. So some people call it more generically batch loading, but essentially what it means is to take a bunch of stuff and load it into the catalog instead of doing it one by one. Now to speak to John's question, I can't answer how many of these we do a year. Some from acquisitions might be able to. I'm sure it's going up as time goes on. It used to be relatively few for ebooks. Bibload in the past 10 years, we've done somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 individual records for electronic materials. And that, we could have an hour-long discussion about the definition of ebook, but we're not going to go there right now. I'm just talking about largely monographic resources that are electronic in nature. But there are some things in here, as Amanda knows, that are music or video or other kinds of formats. So this is a big number. You know, 5-6 years ago, this accounted for a significant proportion of the catalog in whole. I mean, a few years ago, we had basically about 3 million records in the CAT. That has ballooned with recently.
And those aren't all current imprints.
Pardon?
And those aren't all current.
Are or are not? Are not. Many of these are retrospective, so collections we had, but a large number of these, believe it or not, are for things recently purchased that have huge numbers of titles associated with them, like Echo, Ebo, those large aggregate collections that have literally hundreds of thousands of titles in them. So the other way, and I'm going to have to ask for the acquisitions people to help me out here. Does everybody know what DDA means? It used to be called PDA. It used to be called patron-driven acquisitions, and then thought of patrons driving anything scared the heck out of us. So we changed it to demand-driven acquisitions. Is that correct? It's now DDA. And what this is, and Heather would be able to explain it better than I could, but basically every month we load several hundred to several thousand records for ebooks that we have access to, but we haven't technically purchased yet. And so the model there is, if a certain number of patrons click on this link and want to see this content and spend enough time looking at that content, an order is automatically placed. So we've determined, based on the demand, that someone wants to see this, so we'll buy it. And it's all automatic and we don't even have to think about it. This scared people at first because they thought, oh my gosh, people are going to come in here clicking like mad and we're going to spend all our money right away. Well, that didn't happen. Again, this is something the acquisitions folks could explain much better than I could, but be aware of it. The other big piece of the puzzle that happened just within the past couple calendar years, as everybody knows, is Serial Solutions, which is the company responsible for Summon, aka Lion Search. Now, when we implemented their ebook mark service for Serial Solutions and for Summon, that gave us the option of loading everything to which we have access through them into the catalog. And we chose to do that. We could have chosen not to do that and simply assumed that people would go to Lion Search directly and search for content there. But we wanted to have everything in the catalog as well so that people who, for whatever reason, chose not to use Lion Search would still find this stuff. Now the numbers for these are again pretty staggering. In the first calendar year that we had this implemented, that was 2012, from January of last year until December of last year, the number of records we loaded from them was about 250,000. That's a lot of stuff, and it's hard to keep track of. And not only is it hard to keep track of, but the quality of these things, the quality of the records we're loading is very low. Thank you, Christopher. Question?
I'm a little confused about what the content of that stuff actually is. For example, Lion Search searches Gallica, the French National Library thing,
Right.
and it finds individual items in Gallica, but those aren't in our catalog, are they?
Correct.
So what is that stuff?
It's a good question. We did a lot of analysis of the records they were providing, and what we found was a lot of it, or a significant proportion of it, is for things that may or may not be important to us, like the Biodiversity Heritage Library, huge collection of of materials on that topic. That accounted for 40 to 60,000 records, which is a significant chunk of this. There are some other collections that we don't think of too frequently, but when we do, we realize how big they are. But I don't know, to speak to what you're saying, Henry, I think I'm going to hit that in the next point that I make, that the ambiguity of the granularity here comes into play. You know, we say ebook and we think of an ebook as kind of the analog of a monograph. You have one ebook and one monograph. However, as you know, the way e-content is delivered up, especially in the sciences, is by the chapter. So when we say ebook, do we mean this finite kind of PDF file type thing that's almost analogous to a print book? Or do we mean any little bundle of information that's monographic out there for which there is metadata and for which there is a record? And that's an unanswerable question, to me at least. So I'm going to try to speak a little bit more about that in the next point I make. John.
And whether a particular resource that we subscribe to has records that we get from Serial Solutions depends on whether Serial Solutions has access to records for it.
Correct.
And your example is one that apparently they don't. So simply because we subscribe to it doesn't mean that we're going to get records from any of these.
Correct.
ways.
Do we think that might include the Hati Trust full text items, the pre-1923 published in the United States, that we didn't already have in our collection?
It may. It may. And this is
Those are
it
in line
does.
search, but they're not in the cat.
I think it
Oh,
does.
they're not in the cat?
No.
They're indexed now in line.
Yeah, but not
Yeah.
in the cat.
Yeah, so then that's not those.
Right.
the last piece of this puzzle, and we'll come back to those issues, and this is something I know relatively little about, but I want to mention it because it's been automatic for years and we tend to forget about it, is MARCHI. Those are US GPO documents that are in electronic form that are loaded every month. And these account for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of things in the catalog. So one of the reasons I drew a Venn diagram instead of just kind of listing these separately is the nasty part is that these overlap. We're paying for content multiple times, often 3 or 4 or 5 times. Now, we don't like to admit that because it doesn't seem like good fiduciary practice, but we've paid for these records and loaded them, and then, lo and behold, I load a file of 1,000 records and I say, oops, 500 of those bumped into some DDA records. What do? Have these DDA records been purchased? Have they already been vetted by the patron and they say, oh, we want that? So they've already clicked on it and said an automatic purchase has happened? Or are they things that we have records in the catalog for, but we haven't quite purchased them yet? This happens all the time. It's one of my major headaches. So I recently did a bibload that was, thank goodness, relatively small. It was a couple hundred records, and 30 or 40 of them crashed into DDA records. So then there's a conundrum. I have to go through every one of those records and figure out, have we purchased it yet? If we have purchased it, I leave it there and I get rid of the one that was coming in. If we haven't purchased it yet, I delete it from the cat and load the one that we just paid for. If we've already paid for it and they crash together and I don't notice, we've paid twice. Now, this is also true of things that overlap in other ways. For example, all these historical collections that have tens or hundreds of thousands of ebook records associated with them, like 18th century collections online or like early English books. They overlap. There's multiple, these things have been digitized by multiple institutions, so if you go in the catalog or in line search and look for a specific title, you'll often find 5, 6, 7 records for the same exact thing. Now, I'm sure someone down the road, or someone could do an analysis to find out whether this is cost effective, whether we're saving more money by simply doing it this way, or whether we could do it better. My suspicion is we could be doing it better, but I'll leave that to the end when I get to the takeaways. The third thing that I want to talk about in the third topic.
Yeah.
Yes, Henry.
Thank you. Why would we, so if there's 2 records and one of them's a DDA record, and it's already in some sense purchased,
Right.
why would we favor that record?
Because we already spent the money.
Well, we already spent the money on both of them.
Correct, but it was in first. I mean, I guess I see where you're going with that is, are you talking about the quality of the record itself?
We're
Like
talking
what?
about the quality of the product.
That's a good point.
And the fact that the DBA has to be paid for again someday if we use it enough.
That's a good point, and that raises another issue that goes back to the original, the whole, how chaotic this whole thing is. And that is that in the old days, I as a cataloger would simply be given something and I would catalog it. I didn't ask questions, I just cataloged it. Now there are all these other ancillary issues that come up that force me to ask questions like the one you just posed that take time to answer. So I could go to a selector and say, hey, you know, this record locked into this, do you want this or this? That would take up everyone's time forever. That's an infinite amount of time that would be involved to make those questions at the title level, which is why we're having to do things the way we are, at least right now. I'm thinking one of the takeaways I'll have at the end is how we retool to make this more efficient. And I'm glad Lisa's sitting here.
I was just, because you just erased things, I thought it would be appropriate to ask now, what about when you remove?
That is an excellent question. That is
Because that does happen.
correct. Now, what do you want to know about removing a DDA record?
Well, the general question is usually, when will the record go away? And that probably varies, right? And then, you know, if it goes away, is there any way then later to go back and figure out what could we get then?
Well, I think you're talking about two kinds of removal.
Yeah.
The one kind of removal that I am responsible for nominally is if I notice that it's a duplication of something we've already bought. And then I will personally go in and take it out because I know we're getting something else that duplicates that content. I think you're also asking, are these DDAs loaded in perpetuity? Carolyn's nodding her head. Someone from acquisitions would be able to answer that.
The way I was thinking is that someone has to actually hit on that book 3 times and view it for a while, and
Right.
then it becomes a purchase.
But I think John's
But it
question
stays
is,
there.
how long do we let these things sit in the catalog without them being purchased?
Exactly.
And
I've got some information on this. Last year, about 600 or 800 records were removed from the CAT that were DBA records because the vendor notified us that they no longer can provide those titles. Not
Correct.
because of us removing them, because they were removed by the vendor as part of the package.
correct.
Those
That
were
was-
posted by Heather for selectors to look at in case they wanted to take an action like, you might have gone in to order a book, but you saw a DBA record, so you didn't order the book, but now that's disappeared, and so you might want to order something. So
Right.
there is a posting of those 600 or 800 or so titles somewhere, and I looked at it, and I was pleased that there wasn't much that seemed very important on it.
Go ahead, John.
But this happens with products other than DBA products. And on a scale that I doubt that we could do the same thing to check on. There are a lot of these things that will remove content for various reasons.
Correct.
Will inform us that this content is no longer available.
Correct.
And
And we are able to do that at least for the bib loads because we keep track of everything we've loaded. And then, for example, if we stop paying for access to a certain package, I can tell Todd, this is the load, this is the load date, this is the number, we want them out. Because now, that's easy for ebooks because there's no holds associated with them. It's not something we could do with print materials. But I think
My real question was then for you, Jeff, how does this impact you? So, or that?
it crushes me like a bug.
I know.
All this stuff crushes me like a bug.
Loading, but then deduping, and then
Right.
a vendor outside of our control.
Correct. It goes back to the chaos, and we're not managing our content anymore. Let me first answer your question because as I thought about it as other people were talking, I believe Bob Allen said at a forum a while ago that in theory these DDA records will live forever. They're just, we put them in the CAT, we're going to leave them there. To answer the second part of what you were saying, do you want to repeat that or do you want me to leave it to the end? Because I'm going
Which
to...
one you want to address it?
Okay, well...
Because I want to add another question.
Yes.
It's sort of related. Why are you deleting those records if they trust you like a bug, so you don't have to answer it now, but maybe you answered it with bugs.
Well, what I was said somewhat flippantly about crushing like a bug was that there's too much for me to stamp. It's like stamping out fires, you know, in the Midwest when the whole landscape's on fire. Well, presumably because we're serving the patrons, and if they click on the link and they can't get to the content, they're going to be irate.
And they do all the time.
And they do all the time. And one of the last things I'm going to talk about is assessment and metrics for this. How are we doing, and how do we know how we're doing? I can give examples of what John was talking about. I guess I'll give them later. I'm going to move on. I don't want to run over. The next thing I want to talk about is kind of a conundrum that's related to how people find this stuff. Okay, this is the fancy cataloger word for data about data. It's what we create so that people can find stuff. And in the old world, it was the card catalog. We would get a book, someone would catalog it, that is, they would create a bunch of cards for it so that people coming in would look through the cards and say, I want something about, I don't know, spaceships. They look for spaceships, they could go find it. Catalogers like people to believe that without metadata, things become much less findable. So if there were no card catalog, if there were no good quality metadata, we wouldn't be able to find the books that we own and other stuff. That, I think, is more true in the old world than it is in the new world, and I'll tell you why. Now, what is this? This is a word I made up. I'm sure other people have made it up. But when you're searching for a book, you're basically, if you go to the CAT, you're only searching the metadata. You're searching the catalog record about that book that points to that physical object. When you're searching for an ebook, you don't know what you're searching. At least I don't know what I'm searching, and I've been at this a long time. You are definitely searching metadata if there is a record in the catalog or line search. So if you type spaceships, and spaceships happens to be in the metadata, that may or may not get you to the book you want. But because we live in a full text, indexed, abstracted online environment, you might also be searching, without knowing it, the full text of the item itself. So you might type in spaceships, and the results you get has nothing to do with the metadata. The cataloger didn't have spaceships in the metadata for whatever reason. But you found it because it was in the item itself. You might have also found it because there was some user review or what we call patron supplied metadata that said, oh, I really like this book. It doesn't have anything about spaceships in it, but I really liked it anyway. And you're going to get a hit, even though it has nothing to do with spaceships. So my point here is, in the new environment, in the online environment for ebooks, you're searching against so much stuff, and you don't know what you're searching against most of the time, that it's a lot harder to manage the search and retrieval and access process than it was in the old world, where we had a pretty good handle on how things happened. Now, Binky probably knows this because you probably monitor the summon, the clients list.
Sometimes, well,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay, you know, every once in a while, people on the Summons client list, and these are the libraries that have implemented Summon and are using it as we're using Lion Search. They will get in these back and forth discussions about, I just searched this and these are the results I got. Why isn't it the same as your results? And then somebody else will say, oh, I just searched it 15 minutes ago and it looks totally different to me. And there's only so much of this I can take. So
That was the best response ever.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to read it because I got fan mail about that response from Serial Solutions, and I'm going to read that too. So this is my email that I sent to the Summon list after one of these infinite number of back and forth, you know, why isn't it like this? Why isn't it like that? This was my original note. A personal observation, parens, as a cataloger with 20 plus years of experience, close parens, based on the dynamic nature of what's indexed, how and by whom, and who searches what, how, and to what end, no one, and I mean no one, fully understands or can fully explain why, at one moment in time, a given search initiated in a given database or metadatabase produced result set X, whereas a second, seemingly equivalent or parallel search produced result set Y, with little or no easily inferable relationship between the two result sets. With the advent of databases/services like Google and even Summon, we have arrived, for better or worse, in an age where try as we might, we really don't know what's going on. We still enjoy telling ourselves that we do, but we don't, and it's okay. Now, I got a lot of fan mail for this, but I'm going to read the one from, this person's name is Ann Lenzini. She's a trainer at Serial Solutions. She said, "Dear Jeff, my name is Ann Lenzini, and I'm a trainer with Serial Solutions. I just wanted to thank you for your observation that you posted to the listserv about 10 minutes ago. As a child of the Google generation, I cannot agree with you more. It's refreshing to see this message written down. Smiley face, sincerely, Ann." Now, my point in reading that is that I think there's a generational thing here. And a lot of what I'm talking about is going to seem, maybe to people here, because it's our lives, somewhat distressing. Like, oh, you know, this is so chaotic and so messed up. But I think for the younger generation, I don't think they see it that way at all. I think in the old days, people coming into the library expected to find things in a certain non-chaotic way. And today, I don't think young people are like that. I think serendipity is almost built into their lives. They're online all the time. There's an almost infinite amount of information out there. They usually end up finding something that's useful to them. So I don't want this to sound overly negative. And we'll get a little bit to more of that at the end. The next thing I wanted to talk about was a challenge we've kind of touched on already, but I want to put it in a different context for you because it has to do with how we manage resources and who's doing what when. I'm a lousy drawer, but I'm going to try to draw something here and see if you can tell me what it is. No, it's not a lipstick, and no, it's not a missile silo. Silent. Okay. Got some farm girls here. Why did I draw a silo? You heard NPR this morning too. The reason I drew a silo is because that's the favorite metaphor for where we keep stuff. And the situation now is, you know, it used to be in the old days, we had the cat. And that's where we kept our stuff. And if you wanted to find our stuff, you went to the cat. And then there was the A to Z list. And that was a different kind of silo, but if you wanted to find certain kinds of stuff, you would search the A to Z list, not the cat, although there was some overlap. And then we got Google Books. And if you want to find some things in Google Books, you can find them in the cat, but only if we have a print copy. If you want to find stuff that we don't have a print copy of, you've got to search Google Books. Oh, but it might be in the A to Z list too, so you might have to search all those things. And then there's also HathiTrust, which, no, that's even, I can't even read that. Why they named it that, I have no idea. So you've got another silo. And then there's the proliferation of silos. You know, I didn't even bother putting WorldCat on here. I'll just write OCLC. But you get my point. All these silos have metadata in them. In an ebook environment, it's especially chaotic because a lot of this stuff overlaps. A lot of it's the same thing. And then when you get down to the institutional level, I didn't even bother talking about all the other little mini silos we have, like Content DM or ScholarSphere, or all the other places we can use as digital repositories for e-content. Nor did I even bother, because it would take me the rest of the time, to write all the little silos for all the other academic libraries in the country that all have the same metadata that we do in many cases. And the problem is not so much the division of the silos. The problem is that they don't talk to each other very well. So people ask me frequently, I forgot to do the one I was just talking about, Lion Search. This relationship is very ambiguous and people don't understand it, is what's in the cat versus what's in Lion Search. Now, I can say with almost plausibility that everything that's in the cat is in Lion Search because nightly we dump everything from the cat into Lion Search. So he's qualifying your yes. John's saying all my stuff. But in effect, everything that's in here is in here. The trouble is the converse is not true. So there's lots of stuff you can search in Lion Search that you would not find in the cat for a number of reasons. So the only reason I bring that up is, well, there are multiple reasons, but the two primary ones are, this is difficult to manage because the metadata is everywhere, and it often duplicates itself. And one of the things we ran into recently, Lisa remembers this, I think you got the email. Somebody from somewhere said, hey, you know, there's a typo in a record for something you sent to HathiTrust. And we did some research and we said, oh, well, we looked in our CAT and sure enough that typo's there. And where did we get the record? We got it from OCLC. And OCLC got it from GPO. And lo and behold, GPO screwed up. So I went into OCLC, I fixed that, but I can't fix GPO because that's the federal government and they're all knowing. So we couldn't do anything about that. We notified HathiTrust and said, hey, the OCLC record has been updated. And Angelina at HathiTrust got back to me and said, hey, we fixed ours, but we don't know how to make GPO fix there. So you can see how confusing it gets and how, to go back to the statement I made to John about it crushes me like a bug, because this whole process took me maybe an hour. And that's for a typo. They spelled planet without the L or something. And I spent an hour worrying about that. And I felt obligated to do so in this case, because it was from one of our partners, HathiTrust. Okay, now just to extend the metaphor of the, well, not so much extend the metaphor, but drive it home, of being crushed like a bug, going back to the scope of what we're talking about. Does anybody have any guess as to how many books, how many records for ebooks are loaded into the catalog every day? So just last calendar year, January 1, 2012 to December 31st, 2012. Does anybody have a guess as to how many records, on average, per day were loaded into the CAT?
Does that count the duplicates?
It does.
500?
10,226.
Sue was actually the closest. It was 8,762 books every single day. So every single day, on average, this is how many records for ebooks went into the catalog. Now, the obvious implication of that is we can't look at them all. There's no way to know whether all of them are good, whether they're decent, whether the URLs work.
Whether they're unique.
Whether they're unique, whether they overlap, whether they're duplicating, whether there's stuff we even have access to, or whether the vendor goofed. So this is a crushing number compared to the old days when cataloging pretty much dealt with 50 to 100,000 physical items per year and was staffed to deal with those physical items. We're just in a new universe now. The second number I want to throw at you is, does anybody have a guess as to how many URLs there are in the CAT? How many potential avenues out towards content are there?
Could be that many plus. I mean, per day.
Correct, but the URLs, there's sometimes multiple URLs in the same record. And the loads, there are URLs that predate that year's worth of stuff.
That's what I say, plus. That's the plus.
Okay, that's the plus. Okay, well, this is a ballpark figure, and the reason it's a ballpark figure is because Mariam nicely ran the exact figure for me in April of last year. So we'll add, it's approximately 1,800,000 URLs. We don't know on any given day how many of them work and how many don't. We don't know if the ones that don't work today will work tomorrow without our having to do anything. So URL maintenance and checking is an extraordinarily difficult task. There is a URL checking report available in the CAT. We haven't systematically run it yet, because what happens is, let's say I run this report against all these URLs and the report spits back, oh, guess what, 60,000 of them are wrong. What do I do then?
Cry.
Yeah, I cry. And the problem, as I just stated, is not only do I cry about maybe fixing them, but I cry about fixing them and finding out they switched them back and now they work the old way. We had a case a year ago where, I think it's Elsevier, but don't quote me because I don't want to give them a bad rep, but it was one of the major vendors. One of the major vendors came to us via Jamie Jamison and said, we had noticed one of the a patron had clicked on a link and said, I'm unable to get to this ebook. Is this a case where I should be able to get to the ebook? And this was a fairly savvy user, it was a faculty person, or is this something that just kind of, oozed into your catalog and you really don't have it? And Jamie went to the vendor, and the vendor got back to us and said, oh, we switched our URL format. So all our book series are offline right now. And Jamie said, well, what are we going to do to fix it? And I was thinking, I'm going to have to go in and globally correct X zillion of these URLs. And the vendor said, oh, don't worry about it. They're going to work in 2 months. So not only could I not fix them, but if I fixed them, I would have been in trouble 2 months later had we not found that out for them. So that's one of the, again, being crushed like a bug, the scale of what we're trying to deal with is very difficult to manage. Now, I'm going to talk briefly, at the risk of getting into a little trouble, about fails. And what do I mean by fails? These are not necessarily epic fails, but they're things that we've done in trying to manage ebooks that I think we wish we could back out of now. And going back to the scale of things where John was asking about removing records, or both Johns were speaking to that issue. About 5 or 6 years ago, we loaded about 30,000 records for what's called the United States serial set. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. It's basically government documents in a historical sense. There are a bazillion of them. And we have them both in microfiche, and we have them online, at that time from LexisNexis. It required a lot of analysis to figure out which records to load, which records not to load, because we needed records that pointed to both the microfiche, which is up on the second floor of Paterno, and the online copies. So we had these. Now this is particularly tricky for the reason that the good thing about ebooks is you can just delete all the records and nobody gets hurt. But physical objects, they're somewhere on a shelf, and someone might actually be using it, someone might have a hold on it, although that might not necessarily be true for these. I don't know how frequently they're used. But you can't simply yank the records out the way you can with some or most online things. So, long story short, we loaded about 30,000 records, which is only a small proportion of what's available for this resource, and managed to figure out a way of loading both the microfiche and an online copy on the same record, which was a huge victory for us. Yay! We got them both covered. And then recently, guess what happened? Well, LexisNexis was acquired by ProQuest. So now, all of these URLs are going to fail starting this summer. There's 30,000 plus of them. So, I could delete all these records, but no, because we still need access to the microfiche. I could delete these copies, but no, because Circe Linux doesn't work that way. I suppose if I really twisted Todd's arm and made him cookies, he might figure out a way to just wipe these out, and then we'd be where we need to be. But now that ProQuest has bought LexisNexis and is providing access not only to this content, but an additional, get this, almost 500,000 records. So that's 500,000 records in addition to the 30,000 we already loaded that we have to load and follow this same system. And going back to the statement I made early on about the cloud, this is a term you often hear in business. We don't talk about it as much in academic libraries, but it comes down to exposure to risk. This is a huge exposure to risk. We don't do risk management very well around here. I don't think we're used to doing risk management. As soon as we load these records, we expose our risk to ProQuest saying, "Oh, we're going to sell ourselves back to LexisNexis, and all these things are going to go away again." So this back and forth becomes very scary, and we don't know how we can manage an environment that is that fluid. That's the first example of a fail. The second example of a fail is this. Steve Herb's not here, is he? Because I'll get in trouble if he's here. Okay. Good. Does anybody know what KCDL stands for? Yes, Deborah said Krauss Curriculum Development Library. And it is a huge collection of curriculum development things that we have on microfiche in the 5th floor. They're actually in the education library. And years ago, records for these became available through OCLC. So what we had in the CAT prior to that was simply one record that said KDCL, and if you wanted to go look through millions and millions of fiches, you could go do that. Well, that's not helpful. I mean, I'm sure there are indexes that exist for this thing. But to find it through the CAT, you could not find an individual title. You were forced to use a secondary finding aid. When OCLC said, hey, we've got records available for these, we, the BibLoad group, spoke to the education library and said, hey, would you like us to load these? And they said, sure. Now, it became complicated when we realized that they don't have the whole collection, but OCLC was selling us the records for the whole collection. So how do we figure out how to get only the records that we want out of that file set and load them? Then we also had the added problem of these are now available online. And they had a subscription. So they wanted online and microfiche. So, like the previous example, we finally managed to load all these records, of which there are about 4,000. And everything was nice, everything was fine. These are reviewed. Every step of this process is reviewed by multiple people, including the people in the education library, so that we know we're all on the same page. And then what happened recently, I found out from Jamie, is that the education library discontinued their subscription to the online. So we've got 4,000 records in the catalog with 4,000 URLs that don't work anymore. Now, what do we do about that? I can't delete the record because they're for the microfiche. I might be able to delete the online copy if I bake cookies for Todd, but again, that's a lot of work for him to do some analysis to figure out how to do this in a reasonable way, and I have to be able to exactly identify which records that this needs to happen for. And then my third and favorite, and I hope this doesn't get me in trouble with too many people, my bugbear.
Jeff, how come we didn't put separate records in for the microfiche and the online?
Good question. We've learned our lesson. We do that now.
We went through a period where we thought it was better. It was like
That's why it was a fail.
the old days where you had, in the CAT, it was confusing to have separate records. So we came at it with this idea, if they were, well, all the formats were on one record, it would make more sense. And we paid the price.
Yeah, and it wasn't necessarily a bad decision at the time. I mean, a lot of people from public services were saying, you know, when people want to find something, they want to see all the formats on the same record. It irritates them when they get multiple records for the same object. They just want to know what formats it's available in as part of that record. So we chose to do it that way with a lot of consultation. It wasn't like that was just pulled out of the hat.
Because patrons click on one record or the other. It's the same thing about they click on records where they looked at the ebook, they clicked on one and didn't on the microfiche and didn't realize, oh, well, we had electronic access to it. So we were trying to help patrons.
Exactly. The reason Google Books is a nightmare in many ways is because, I mean, everybody here knows some piece of the puzzle of the Google Books project. But basically the idea was Google said, we're going to digitize every book that ever existed. We're going to go to all these libraries. We're going to disambiguate their collections and find out who has what so that we can get this from them and this from them and this from them. And then we're going to scan them all and make them available online. So they got, I don't know what the total is now from us, but it's probably tens of thousands. Ian, is it 100,000? Is it that many?
100,000 objects from us?
From us, how many did we send them ultimately?
Times 400,000.
Oh, that many. Okay, well that's even better for my argument. Okay, now, what happened now we're still learning, during the initial phases of this, one thing that happened was we assumed, some of us assumed, I don't want to point fingers, some of us assumed that when Google scanned these things, they would be available online. Wrong. A lot of them aren't, for various reasons, one of which is copyright. You know, there was a huge backlash against this when it first happened because all these authors and publishers said, you know, you can't just scan our stuff and then make it freely available online. That's outrageous. And so there were a lot of legal battles. Excuse me? It's illegal. It's illegal. But one of the side effects of this assumption was, or in the early loads, and I'm hoping that it didn't happen on any of the later loads, where we had people in the library system saying, oh, this book has been scanned by Google. I'll withdraw it. We don't need it anymore. And did I hear some coming from the people? But what happens then, and I'm sure probably everyone in this room has come across one of these, but you have in the catalog what looks like a print book. It's got a call number, you know, let's say TC125.B35 2012, and it's got a barcode. So it looks like a book, except for this. And then there's an API that runs in the catalog that automatically links the book we used to have out to the Google Books database. But when you click on this link, it says snippet view or search only. Nobody wants that. You know, nobody wants that. So you have patrons that are clicking on this, and I get these messages every week, and so does Jamie, and so do other people, I'm sure. Why isn't this book online? Where is this book? And the answer is because we too hastily withdrew materials from our collection, thinking that Google would make them freely available to everyone, and they did not. I don't know if it still happens, but there are tens of thousands of these.
Yes.
There are tens of thousands of these. I had a question from someone the other day about it, but I don't know how many people are actually, I know that people have been told not to, that's a fact. But how many people still do that, either accidentally or intentionally? But the implications of this are huge. I mean, there are tens of thousands of items that we have in the CAT that are pointing out to stuff that doesn't exist and probably will never exist. I mean, these are like recent imprints, a lot, 1992, 93. Google's not going to put them up online without, having to bulldoze a lot of lawyers first. So that's my favorite fail to date, and it's a learning experience because all this stuff changes so quickly that we don't really know what we're doing when we're doing it, and sometimes it's too late to undo it after we've done it. I wanted to touch. Oh, Emily.
About the Google Books, my understanding when that agreement happened was that the schools that loaned out the books were supposed to get a scan from Google.
Correct.
Do we have those? That's not accurate. Okay, so what? So, do you want me to answer? It depends on what the contract is. So Michigan and Wisconsin have separate contracts with Google, which they had predating the CIC contract, and they got their digitized files back. For the rest of the CIC, which includes us, we do not get those files back, and those are held in escrow by Google, and that's been from the very beginning of the year.
I don't get to see this. Why did you sign that contract?
Probably to keep us out of the lawsuit. There was no lawsuit yet.
Okay.
So it was right at the very beginning. So a huge CIC initiative. That was one of the conditions that the CIC signed.
Well, maybe Sue will get in trouble instead of me, so that's good. So thank you for taking some food off me. We've only got a few minutes left, so I want to talk quickly about assessment and metrics since that's so important to the libraries right now. And I'm going to just refer briefly to a couple studies that have been done locally with regard to the use of ebooks. And probably some of you here are already aware of them, so it will be a rehash. But I think it was last fall, maybe it was earlier than that, Bonnie Imler and Bob Tolliver did a study of, I think it was 18 undergraduates at Altoona and how they use ebooks. And what they did was it wasn't so much, it was a little bit about access to ebooks, but it was more about how they use them and how they're able to use them given the interfaces and given the different modalities for finding them, if you will. And I'm just going to summarize very briefly the two pieces of the two findings that were most interesting to me. And one was a question they posed to these 18 undergraduates. If you have an object, if you have a book that is available both in print and an ebook, which one would you rather consult? Which one would be your go-to? And 76% of them, 70% of them said print, which surprised me, frankly, because the propaganda that goes in my ear most of the time is ebooks are the future, and everybody loves ebooks, and undergraduates love ebooks, and they want everything online all the time so that they can find it. And that surprised me. Now, granted, statistically small group, and we don't know why they said that, but the second thing that interested me was Bonnie and Bob asked them, did you encounter any problems in the process of looking for an ebook online? You were given a title and they said, find this ebook however you want to find it. Again, over 70% of them said yes. I had difficulty finding this ebook. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not going to answer the question or bring up anything as a result of that. But I think it raises questions about how we measure and assess the effectiveness of all the stuff I've talked about and what we can do to perhaps make it better. I'm going to finish up real quickly with just opening the floor to questions. I know I covered a lot of stuff. Is there anything anybody would like to ask that I haven't talked about already? Bill.
You haven't talked about, and you're not going to like this.
No, please. I love stuff I don't like.
You haven't talked about longevity, continuity, permanence.
Right.
We like to think we know that if something's in our collection, whatever the collection is today, that it'll be there next year or in 5 years. Clearly,
That's no longer true.
No permanent.
In this environment, there is no longevity. And especially, I mean, everybody, I think, in this room can relate to how, given the technology over the past decade, you know, how compressed and fragmented our lives get. You know, our daily work lives are so like, oh, I've got to pay attention to that, and then. You know, that wasn't the old model. And I think part of that's one of the reasons, Bill, that I think we really need to build into our system kind of a slowdown time and say, you know, we need to think about what we're doing so quickly and figure out the implications of why we're doing it so quickly and what are the preservation and longevity issues around ebooks, because we don't have them. You know, they exist in the cloud. If somebody took a stick of dynamite and blew up West Petit right now and we lost those X 100,000 books, we would be, oh my God! But if Elsevier says, oh, by the way, they just went offline, we go, oh, okay, when will they do that? You know, so when you think about it, and Lisa knows this very well, and one thing I put in the email was, you know, 70% of our collections budget is devoted to e-content now. That's $10 million or more a year. And if we don't control that, what are the implications for us? I mean, how can we better control it? How might we control it or manage it locally in a way that minimizes the exposure to risk? And how do we communicate that to our users in such a way that their expectations meet or jibe with what we're able to provide? And that's the ideal situation where we can give people exactly what they want or more, and they're not coming into the library and clicking on stuff and going, you know, where is that? Why isn't that working? So. Lisa, Henry, and then Deborah. Lisa.
So you talked at the beginning about, you know, coming up with some solutions or some of your ideas for organization to mitigate some of the crushing like a bug.
Right.
So are you going to be able to get to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think very quickly. Okay. This is Jeff's workload. This is Jeff's salary. What we need to do is we need to shift some of this over here. And I think everybody would be much happier.
No, we need to clone Jeff.
Seriously though, I think what I was starting to say to Bill applies here is I think that the environment has become so fragmented, so fast moving, that I really think we need to step back from the old models we use for managing print content and think, is this the best way to do this? Not only with the old mindset, and again, this is a generational thing, of librarians in general are very anal retentive people. They like things to be in order. They like to know how things are going to happen and when they're going to happen. And I think that mindset is almost a disadvantage in this age. I mean, you have to, you know, the words get thrown around a lot, and it's very easy to say agile or flexible or, you know, responsive. But those are true values, and we have to build them into the environment in a way that I don't think they are right now. Henry.
Yeah, and I think my question, that isn't a question at all, reinforces that in some ways. And that's, you know, yeah, we have moved on to a more chaotic method of providing information. But a lot of people have wanted more chaos from us for a very, very long time. And there's a lot of very good things that are happening because of it. What we have to be mindful of, I think, are two things that, you know, anytime you gain ground, you lose ground. And where we're losing ground, but I think where it counts for users, is that there's a kind of a problem that used to be typified by, you know, I need 5 basic books on X, let's say, or 5 introductory materials. It doesn't have to be a book. So some broad topic, design. You cannot solve that problem in these types of environments. You still need some way of pulling together the very general things for the beginners. And the new environments, none of the search engine style environments help with that problem. They help with a lot of other problems. They're wonderful. I can't live without it. The other thing is that sometimes when you're teaching a discipline, you need the student to have a place to play that represents that discourse community. A bunch of information that's all part of that one discourse community. And all of these new environments are thoroughly interdisciplinary, which is wonderful. But it means that people no longer get introduced to a discourse community. And I think as we begin to be able to find ways to influence the development of systems, we have to yearn for those two things. They're becoming big negatives. And I think we have to find ways to supply those needs too. What we're doing with the chaos is absolutely wonderful. There's an exhibit behind that touches on to some fun ideas about chaos and life.
Deborah, did you still have something? Okay, John.
Maybe as a wrap-up and address not to you, but to the rest of us, I think we were hoping that this would be the beginning of a conversation. And I think we've only begun talking to each other about this. I think there are some fundamental issues here about how we do things and how we assess how well we're doing things. And I think we need to look for some opportunities to continue this conversation. So I just throw that out there. Anybody who has ideas, I'm sure they would be welcome.
Anything else?
Well, I'm on the front line, so whose email do I get a page from?
Jamie Jamison, the ER help desk. Yeah, I mean that is the main conduit, or an oops message.
I'm really serious about this, though.
I agree.
Because we're asked about it all the time, and we all work different shifts. We have late, people who work middle of the night. I'm until 6 o'clock. I'm on Sundays. If someone's having a problem locating and does not understand that they can't get this online content, we don't know who to send them to. So I'm asking.
That's yeah. Well, the easy, quick answer is the ER help email address or an oops message.
There's
However,
also, excuse me,
go ahead.
Jeff, in Lion Search now, there's a chat that's library help.
Okay.
Over on the right-hand side, yeah.
Okay.
How many hours?
Well, that's staffed by Knowledge Commons and Library Learning Services.
There's a group
Is that
of us
right?
who are meeting to try, we've identified all these help places. And we're talking about trying to consolidate these in some way so that behind the scenes they go to a common place. And that also the help form that you use might actually probe you for more, how did you access it, what was the error message. So at least there would be a series of prompts that would...
This is something that you're changing?
There's a small group of us talking about it, but that's not all I want to say right now. But we recognize that I'm getting lots of questions through World Campus of students who can't, World Campus students who aren't getting where to go. So we think that a form that would actually have some prompts for some questions would save a step, and that Jamie or whoever gets it on the other end would have to say, well, so back and say, where did you come in, what was the error message? So, and it would also help you if you're in chat to what things you should be asking the patron so you could problem solve it at the time. So we're kind of thinking along.
All right, well, thank you.
One more quick, Sue.
I'm taking it from the viewpoint of if the book is checked out, it's on the shelf, they can't get access to it. So it's online, the system doesn't work, they can't get access to it. Same concept, but the expectation, the expectation is that if it's online, it's got to be there, and I got to get access to it now. But hey, it's checked out. It's not available.
And there are some online services that work that way, that we only have a limited number of users to. But I think on the other hand, that's a good question. What are user expectations? My gut reaction to that is among young people, they're less irritated by not getting to something on the first click than someone from my generation.
Yeah, if they'll find something alternatively.
Right, and that's why I think we need to understand the expectations before we can build that into the process. But I agree, it's not necessarily a bad thing that they can't get to.
Yeah, and the whole idea is that we're really renting these things. We don't own it. There's longevity issues, we're not expecting...
Bill's smiling and I'm smiling inwardly because in many cases, well, we have bought this in perpetuity in many cases. We have bought this content. And so if we're not loading it locally, it's up in the cloud. We do own it. We've paid for it. And we can have it as long as we...
don't have it physically here.
Correct.
That's if we don't own it. It's not here. I can't, it's not here.
Yeah,
We're
that's,
missing it.
that's part of the ongoing discussions.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate your feedback. That's what I was hoping.